Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the podcast, Taking Notes, Equity, in Expressive Arts. I am your host, Alexander Hudipole Wolf. In today's episode, I will be talking about redefining what success looks like. How do we measure success in our students, as well as how we measure our own success as teachers, therapists, etc. The idea of success is a concept that applies to many things in our lives. While this episode will be focusing on redefining what success looks like in the music world, you can apply these ideas to any other facet in your life. Before I talk about what success looks like as musicians, I first want to define the dictionary definition of success. The favorable or prosperous termination of attempts or endeavors, the accomplishment of one's goals, the attainment of wealth, position, honors, or the like. A performance or achievement that is marked by success, as by the definition of honors. For example, the play was an instant success. I am going to reference this definition multiple times throughout this episode. While it is true that musicians can define success in many different ways, I have found that growing up and learning music through school, that the idea of success can be pretty linear. From a young age, I have made the revelation that the idea of success, when it comes to learning to play music, typically comes from mastering all of the techniques and concepts that your teachers taught you and being able to replicate them perfectly. If I was unable to replicate or perform a specific concept perfectly, then it was not a success. Success also came from being able to perform a piece or multiple pieces of music on stage to near perfection, as well as receiving tremendous praise from our professors. It can also be defined as learning a specific piece in a certain amount of time. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with having these concepts as the markers of success. However, I believe there are times when this default way of determining what success is can be a detriment to our students as well as to ourselves. It can be a common experience for teachers to be frustrated with their students and to see them not as achieving success if they are not able to replicate or perform a certain song, technique, etc. within a certain amount of time. It is also common for students to be frustrated with their teachers or with the whole learning process in general because they are not getting a certain concept quickly enough. With that said, I am not advocating that we have no expectations from our students. Learning music is a challenging process, and in order to grow as musicians, I believe it is important that we all go through these times of growth and discomfort. However, I do think it can become an issue if that one default way of defining success is the only way that teachers and students are measuring their own. As I mentioned earlier, teachers may define their students' success as their ability to perfectly replicate everything that their teacher taught them. Also, if the students continue to make progress week after week and are continually improving their abilities as a musician, that can be seen as your students being successful. However, I think that measuring success can be largely determined by your students' own goals and expectations. Referencing back to the dictionary definition of success, the first definition stated the favorable or prosperous termination of attempts or endeavors, the accomplishment of one's goals. To me, the key words that stick with me are the accomplishment of one's goals. Of course, one of the goals of learning music is to learn, and that's what teachers are there for, right? To bestow all of their knowledge upon their students so that they can play music independently. While that may be true to an extent, I believe that every student learns in different ways and that their expectations of what they want to get out of their lessons can sometimes be different from what the teacher expects. For example, I have a student that has been learning adapted piano with me for the past several years. In a traditional sense, I could have structured the session where I am incorporating music theory along with piano techniques. However, this student was much more interested in performing their favorite Disney song on piano rather than focusing on learning piano technique and theory. It's not that I completely avoid teaching my student theory and technique, but the bulk of my lesson planning involved teaching my student how to play that song. And I believe that song that my student was interested in was Tale as Old as Time from Beauty and the Beast. This may appear to be a completely backwards way of teaching, but one of my approaches when it comes to adapted lessons is to focus on student preferred music first and then try to incorporate the theory and technique later. I can talk more in depth about how I accomplished this specifically with my adapted piano lessons in a later episode. Even if my student can't play every scale on the piano or even struggles to identify specific notes on the staff without some form of visual aid, they found it successful that they were able to replicate one of their favorite songs on piano. To me, that is a form of success for my students. If I focus primarily on theory and technique from the beginning and would not allow my student to perform their song until they reach points A, B, C, etc., they probably would not have stuck with piano for that long. Once again, I completely acknowledge that this is a backwards way of approaching music lessons to most teachers. But another important factor that I take into consideration is to find what inspires and motivates my students to play music. Their lessons may not appear to be successful if you're looking at it from the default way of what success looks like for musicians that I mentioned earlier. However, because they were able to accomplish their own goals, not necessarily the goals that I expected from my student, that I view my student as a successful musician. This might be my own personal philosophy, but success to me is helping my students find ways that music brings them joy, not necessarily that they have the skills and abilities to audition to a major music college. Before I move on, I wanted to focus a little bit more on this idea of discovering our own students' goals and expectations when learning music. Quickly going back to the default way of defining success, I do think some teachers teach music to their students with the specific intention that they will eventually audition to go to a major music college or that they will use music as a career. Going back to the example of my adapted piano student that I described before, their intention is not to use music as a career or to audition for a college program. They're using music as a personal enjoyment and to enhance their own quality of life. Now, if my student did express the interest of auditioning for a music program, and they did not express the interest to work on theory and technique, that would be a completely different conversation. The way that I would structure my lessons would completely change, and the theory and technique aspect would be something that would be pivotal for my students' success, regardless of whether they want to do it or not. In my own personal experience, I have found, for the most part, that if a student is intrinsically motivated to accomplish something, like auditioning for college, they are much more willing to listen to your feedback and to accomplish the tasks you give them. That's why working with young students can be tricky, because they may not know if learning to play music or learning to play a specific instrument is something they really want to do. I have had many experiences where young students are in band or taking piano lessons or any type of instrumental lesson. They're doing it because their parents are making them do it. With that said, there are students who were forced to play music from a young age that turned out to love it, and there are others that hated it. Sidetracking myself a little bit here, I do understand that parents expose their children to many different experiences to see what sticks. When I was growing up, I remember that my mom had me do soccer, gymnastics, swimming, music lessons, and taekwondo almost all at the same time. And going through all of those different experiences, I found out that I really loved my music lessons and I loved taekwondo. I kind of like swimming. It was fun, but it wasn't something I really wanted to continue doing lesson-wise. And I absolutely hated soccer and gymnastics. Kind of funny, I actually love watching soccer now, but as a kid, I absolutely hated the idea of playing soccer. Once again, I am not advocating that we are completely lax with the way we teach our students, but rather, I want to emphasize the importance of identifying the goals and of expectations that our students have and being able to meet them to the best of our ability. After you have a better understanding of what your student wants to get out of your lessons, you can then gauge their level of success based on that. This will also enable you to develop a lesson plan that best suits your students' needs. Similar to how we measure success in our students, I think it is important that we understand how we measure our own success as educators. Once again, everyone measures their success as educators in their own ways, but focusing specifically on music education, in my own personal experience, typical markers of success that teachers use to gauge their levels of success include how many music competitions their students perform in, what chair their student is in, like first chair, second chair, third chair, etc., what grade their students got in their NYSSMA Solo Festival, how many students got accepted into a prestigious music program, how many students went off to do music as a career, either as educators, performers, etc. Now, once again, there is nothing inherently wrong with having these being your markers of success as a teacher. However, similar to what I described beforehand, I think it can become a problem if this becomes your default way of measuring your own success as educators. Going back to what I discussed before, it is possible that our students' goals and expectations are completely different compared to what your expectations and goals are for your students. Therefore, if our expectations of our students is to perform a specific instrumental piece for a NISMA solo festival and they're showing a disinterest or progress seems much slower than expected, we might become frustrated not only with our students but with ourselves. This is why I believe it is important that every teacher strives to understand their students' own expectations and goals. Going back to my student who plays Tale's Oldest Time on the piano, their goal and expectation at that time was to play the song on piano. The song wasn't flawless by any means, but we got it to a point where my student was satisfied with the way it sounded. Essentially, because my student found success in reaching their own goals, I too felt success as a teacher in helping my student reach their goal. Personally, I measure my success as a teacher by gauging how much my students enjoy the process of playing music and learning about music and how it can inspire them. Ultimately, my philosophy is using music to inspire my students. This can come in the form of my students being inspired to play music that they enjoy, which could also lead them to discovering and finding new music that they want to learn to play. It could also inspire them to try something completely different than what they even anticipated. Maybe it could inspire my students to want to go to college to be a music performer, educator, or therapist, or to do music as a profession. Or it could inspire them to continue playing music as a hobby or for their own pure enjoyment, even if they don't want to go to college for music. It might even inspire them to do something that is completely non-music related. With all that said, not every student is going to become motivated or inspired by music, and that's completely okay too. The most important thing to think about is that you did the very best that you could with your student, and you gave it your all. If you have done that and you were not able to help your student reach their goals or inspire them, then you did the best you could, and there's no shame in that. To be completely honest, there may be times when your students' goals and expectations are those that you as a teacher do not feel equipped or comfortable working with, and that's completely okay too. I am under the firm belief that no one has all the answers. If you do come across someone that claims to know everything, run in the other direction. Part of being an educator is knowing your strengths and weaknesses, which also includes knowing what your own limitations and scope of practice is. There were times when I referred and transferred students to different faculty members in the EA department because I felt like I was not knowledgeable enough in the area that the student was interested in learning. However, depending on the circumstances, I always try to give it my best effort to work with all of my students. Sometimes this leads me to discover new ways of teaching that I would never have thought of until then. Thank you so much for tuning into Taking Notes, Equity and Expressive Arts. Remember that everyone deserves the opportunity to express themselves in their own unique way. Every voice matters, and every form of expression deserves to be valued. Until next time, keep taking notes.